Hi, I'm Elden from Company of the Staple. We're a 14th century living history group making videos about handcrafts and history. Today I need to sew a neckline for a coat that I'm making for my portrayal of a working man in Calais in 1376. The coat's made of wool, so it's not particularly prone to fraying, and I could just kind of fold the edge over and stitch it down and be done with. But the neckline is an area of the garment that I think is worth investing a little bit of extra effort into, and based on the historical record, I think a medieval tailor would have agreed with me. For this neckline, I'm referring to the book Textiles and Clothing, circa 1150 to 1450, Medieval Finds from Excavations in London, particularly the chapter Sewing Techniques and Tailoring. All surviving facings and bindings are of a fine tabby silk on the straight grain of the fabrics. No bias strip is known to have been used for this purpose on bias cut or curving edges. So there's two things here. Firstly, all of the surviving facings are silk. Just because only silk facings have survived doesn't mean that all of the facings were silk. It is possible that some facings were linen, but no linen has survived in the London finds due to the conditions of the ground and the different composition of linen fibre and silk fibre. The book goes on to describe a surviving example of a silk facing that may have been a neckline. A 3mm fold of the curved woolen edge has been turned inward and covered with a 5mm wide strip of silk, held firmly in place by 2 rows of tiny running stitches which slightly puncture the upper outer surface. The lower edge of each facing is additionally held in place by small slanted hem stitches, approximately 3 to 4mm apart. So the body of my coat is made of brown wool. It's a relatively fine wool. The fabric on the extant neckline described in Textiles and Clothing must have been pretty fine because it's turned in 3mm, and if you're working with a really chunky wool, you can't really get a 3mm fold. For the facing, I'm using a white silk taffeta. It's 80 GSM weight. It's plain or tabby weave, just like the one described in Textiles and Clothing. To create the facing, I need to cut a strip of the silk taffeta to be 5mm plus seam allowances on each side. I'm going to go for a 2.5mm seam allowance on each side, so I need a 10mm strip of silk. Before I worry about that, this silk is really wrinkled and needs ironing, so I'm going to set up my iron to the silk setting and iron it all smooth. Much better. Now I need a straight edge on the fabric that is exactly straight to the grain. To get that, I'm going to find the first continuous thread that I can past all of these jagged edges and then pull that thread out of the fabric like a drawstring. Once I've removed that thread, it leaves a clear straight line along the fabric in line with the weave. And I can cut down that line, measure in 10mm, pull out a second thread, and cut again. Now once I've got the 10mm strip of silk, I need it folded along the long sides. So I've wet the silk down here with a little spray of water, and I'm just doing my best to wrestle one side into the center line and then the other and just press it down with my fingers. Once it's as good as I can get it, I'll iron it all out to set the crease, being careful again to use the silk setting on the iron. You can see there are some threads fraying off the silk as I work it, and I'm just doing my best to ignore them for now. There are a few wiggles in my silk facing, but the final width is pretty consistent to 5mm, and I'm happy enough to continue. Now there are a couple of ways to turn the edge of the wool, either before applying the facing or after applying the facing. The description on the book with the running stitches piercing the surface of the wool makes me suspect that the edge was turned before applying the facing. In the past I've always turned over the edge of the wool and then applied the silk onto the turned wool, but it's a bit of a hassle. In this case, I'm going to try turning it after. It's a bit more of a modern approach, sewing and then kind of folding around your stitching. But if it's faster and gives a better result, the end product should be functionally identical. So to get started, I've marked a chalk line on the good side, that's the outside of my coat's body panel, and I'm pinning the inside of the facing to the outside of the wool, just inside the chalk line. Pins can sort of mess up the fine silk, and there starts to get a lot of them stabbing every which way. So by the time I got halfway around, I decided to switch to basting to hold the silk on. The basting's slower to set up, but it's a lot nicer when you're sewing. If you haven't tried basting your seams instead of pinning them, you should give it a go sometime. Once the facings are pinned or basted on, I stitch with a running stitch very close to the outside edge. I'm using the straight grain of the silk as a guide, trying to keep my stitches between about the second and third threads in the weave of the silk. Once the edge of the facing is secure, I can trim the wool away about 2 or 3 millimeters from my stitch line. I'm being very careful here to pull the silk out of the way from my cutting from underneath, because if I cut into the silk, I'm going to want to start all over again. Next, I wet down the wool and the facing, and I flip it all to the inside of the garment and then press it. I've put a few pins in to hold the outside edge of the facing down before starting on the next run of stitching. So for that, I'm stitching the outside edge of the facing to the inside of the garment with the small slanted hem stitches 3 to 4 millimeters apart that are described in the book. I'm trying to pick up some of the wool weave without the stitch showing through to the front, and then a few threads of the silk facing with each stitch. This wasn't a complete success, and there are more than a few stitches visible on the outside from this row. All that remains now is the 2 rows of tiny running stitches, barely showing through to the front of the fabric. Now this has given me trouble in the past, trying to get those short, shallow stitches, so I decided to try a new tactic that I have heard about. The tiny running stitches, I'm assuming from context in the book, should be about 1 to 2 millimeters, but I just can't get my needle in and then back out of all this fabric in that shorter space, and my running stitches turn out more like 4 millimeters. So if I can't control how long the underside of the stitch is, I can control the spacing on the top of the stitches. So I'm making the running stitches from the outside of the garment, but starting each stitch on top of the end of the last stitch so that they're still barely showing on the outside. So that's my neckline facing done. You can see here the first row of running stitches, and then the second row of running stitches, and then the hem stitches as they were described in Textiles and Clothing. The neckline is very close to the shape of my pattern, and it hasn't stretched or deformed while I've been working it. It's a nice tight fold, and I think it's a very tidy result. Now, the keen-eyed may have noticed that this neckline is far too small for me to actually fit over my head, and that's because this is going to be a front button closure down the throat, and I haven't cut that yet. That's also why there's sort of untidy ends of the facing, because until I cut the front slit and look at buttons and buttonholes, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing in that area. I hope this is of some use to you in your own sewing projects, and if you've got questions or you've got some feedback for me about how I can do this a little bit more easily, I would love to hear from you. Get in touch or leave a comment. Thank you.